Disappearing 9 patch and queen size quilt tutorial. Materials and equipments needed. Fabrics that measures 5 by 5 inches. To make a queen size quilt, you need 400 blocks of fabrics that measures 5 by 5 inches. Thread that matches the fabrics. Fabric scissor or cutter. Ruler. Fabric marker. Sewing machine. Iron. Quilt basting spray. 4 cuts of fabric that measures 5 inches in width and 100 inches in length for the border. 3 cuts of fabrics that measures 48 by 100 inches for the backing if you don't have the 120 width of fabric. Otherwise, you can use 120 by 100 if you have. Fabrics that measures 2.5 inches by 400 inches for the binding. Queen size quilt foam. Needle for hand sewing. These are the steps. Arrange 9 blocks according to your preference. This was the setting of my sewing machine. The edge of the fabric was lined with the pressure foot. Sew the fabrics together. To have a perfect corners, line the seams properly. These are some of the finished blocks. Arrange the blocks according to your preference. For queen size quilt, you need 14 by 14 blocks. Arrange your blocks in your bed or in the floor so you can design properly and arrange the colors the way you want. When I was making the blocks, I put a different solid colors on the center so I can arrange the blocks like these. When you're done with your design, gather all your blocks by rows and sew them together. It's easier to sew by rows one at a time to keep your Another way of gathering your blocks is to gather all together, then put a number so you will not get confused when you sew. Next step will be sewing the blocks together. Connect the blocks by putting them right sides together. To have a perfect corners, line the seams properly. To sew the fabrics together, line the side of the fabrics with the side of the pressure foot. The setting of my machine was this. Sew the blocks by row. Next step, connect the fabrics by rows. The process is the same. Line the seams together to have a perfect corners. The setting and the placement of the pressure foot should be the same. Next step, iron the quilt to make it flat and free of wrinkles. For the backing fabric, sew the fabrics together. Iron to make it flat and free of wrinkles. Next step, attaching the border fabric. Have an allowance of 6 inches at the edge of the fabric. Attach the fabric border with the quilt. Secure it with a fabric clips or pins. Attach all the fabric borders around the quilt. Make an allowance of 6 inches in all the edges. You will use these allowance when you miter the corners and connect them all together. The setting of my machine and the pressure foot are all the same. Sew the fabric borders one at a time. Sew the next border fabric right after the other one. Overlap the 6 inches edges to miter the corners later. Next step, iron the fabric borders to make it flat and free of wrinkles. Next step, miter the corner of the border fabrics. Fold the edge of the upper border fabric into a 45-degree angle. Iron to make it flat and free of wrinkles. The line that you will create with this ironing will be your stitch line later on. Do the same process to all the 4 corners. Miter the corners and iron. Sew the line you made earlier when you ironed the border fabrics. Cut the excess border fabrics. Do the same process in all the corners of the border. Sew the fabric borders together and cut the excess fabrics. Iron the border of the quilt to make it flat and free of wrinkles. Next step will be combining the quilt foam and backing fabric together. Lay your quilt foam on the floor to make it flat. Remove the wrinkles with your hands or feet. Lay the backing fabric on top of the quilt foam. Flatten the fabric and remove the wrinkles. Spray the quilt basting spray on the quilt foam. Stick the backing fabric with the quilt foam. Flatten and remove the wrinkles by hand. Turn the quilt foam on the other side. Flatten and remove the wrinkles by hand. Lay the quilt above the quilt foam. Flatten and remove the wrinkles by hand. Spray the quilt foam with quilt basting spray. Then stick the quilt with the quilt foam. Flatten and remove the wrinkles by hand. Next step will be quilting. We will use stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch means that you quilt by following along the patchwork seam lines. You stitch along the seams that join those square blocks. Next step, sew the end of the border fabric. This was the setting of my machine. The pressure foot was lined with the edge of the fabric. Next step, cut the excess fabric and quilt foam. Next step, making the binding. First, make a continuous bias. Connect the fabrics by joining together. To join the two fabrics, lay the other fabric on top of the other right sides together in a 90-degree angle. Then sew a 45-degree angle to join them. Cut the excess fabric 1/2 inch from the thread. Then separate the two fabrics by hand pressing. Next step, make the continuous bias. Fold the fabric into 2 equal parts. Then iron to make it flat. When you see the connecting jointed fabrics, separate the fabrics and iron. Then fold into half and iron, the same way with the rest of the bias. Next step will be binding. Start sewing the bias 6 inches from the edge. Secure the two fabrics together with fabric clips or pins. This will help you to attach the two edges of the bias later on. This was the setting of my machine. The pressure foot was lined with the edge of the fabric. Look how I mitered the corner. 1/2 inch before you reach the corner, Exit the needle in a 45-degree angle. Then fold the bias into a 45-degree angle following the angle of the border. Then fold the bias down in line with the edge of the border. Sew the edge with the same machine and pressure foot setting. I will show you one more time. How to attach the two edges of the bias. Overlap the edges by 2.5 inches. Cut the excess fabric. Join the two edges by laying one fabric on top of the other right sides together in a 90-degree angle. Then sew the two fabrics in 45-degree angle. cut the excess fabric ½ inch from the thread. Separate the two fabrics and hand press. Line the edge of the bias with the fabric border. Then sew the two fabrics together. Next step, iron the binding to make it flat. Next step, hand stitch the binding using a blind stitch. First, insert your needle inside the border fabric, then insert the needle inside the bias. Note: insert your needle after the stitches of the border to hide the stitches. Alternately do this several times, then pull the thread to lock. It will then hide the thread when you pull. Note how I mitered the corner. I use whip stitch to join the two pieces together. I will show you how I mitered the corner one more time. This is the finished product. I hope you learned from my video. Press subscribe and share to support my channel. Press the bell button to be notified with my upcoming videos. Thank you.